My name is Barbara Olick Hamilton. Currently, of course, I'm a bookseller at Rediscovered Books, but I have a previous life as an English teacher. During the times I was as being an English teacher, I taught Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut Jr. for many years. It has always been a controversial book. It started being banned 3 years after it was first published. It has still been banned in many places in the U.S. It's banned for its language. It's accused of being pornographic at times because it talks about and describes some sexual acts. It's also been called anti-American and anti-Christian and anti-Jewish. So it has been banned on just a plethora of reasons. I'm going to read from you a passage towards the end of the book, but first I need to tell you a little bit about the setup. The main character is Billy Pilgrim, who's a 19-year-old chaplain's assistant who goes into World War II, is captured during the Battle of the Bulge, late 1944. The part I'm going to read describes after they've been captured, they've gone to a prisoner of war camp. They are put in with a group of English officers who, through a mishap with the Red Cross, have been getting twice the number of care packages for the entire time of the war, so they have lots of food, lots of goodies. They prepare a feast for the Americans, greet them as fellow heroes, put on a performance of Cinderella for them, feed them, of course, way too much, so all the Americans get sick. The next day, the English are ready to get rid of the Americans because they think they are messy savages, and the Germans are ready to ship them off to Dresden to become laborers. And so this passage describes that leaving and Billy Pilgrim's first look at Dresden, where he's being sent. The temperature climbed startlingly that day. The noontime was balmy. The Germans brought soup and bread in two-wheeled carts that were pulled by Russians. The Englishmen sent over real coffee and sugar and marmalade and cigarettes and cigars, and the doors of the theater were left open so the warmth could get in. The Americans began to feel much better. They were able to hold their food, and then it was time to go to Dresden. The Americans marched fairly stylishly out of the British compound. Billy Pilgrim again led the parade. He had silver boots now, and a muff, and a piece of azure curtain which he wore like a toga. Billy still had a beard. So did poor old Edgar Derby, who was beside him. Derby was imagining letters to home, his lips working tremulously. "Dear Margaret, we are leaving for Dresden today. Don't worry, it will never be bombed. It's an open city. There was an election at noon, and guess what?" And so on. They came to the prison railroad yard again. They had arrived on only 2 cars. They would depart far more comfortably on 4. They saw the dead hobo again. He was frozen stiff in the weeds beside the track. He was in a fetal position, trying even in death to nestle like a spoon with others. There were no others now. He was nestling with thin air and cinders. Somebody had taken his boots. His bare feet were blue and ivory. It was all right somehow, his being dead. So it goes. The trip to Dresden was a lark. It took only 2 hours. Shriveled little bellies were full. Sunlight and mild air came in through the ventilators. There were plenty of smokes from the Englishmen. The Americans arrived in Dresden at 5 in the afternoon. The boxcars were open, and the doorways framed the loveliest city that most of the Americans had ever seen. The skyline was intricate and voluptuous and enchanted and absurd. It looked like a Sunday school picture of heaven to Billy Pilgrim. Someone behind him in the boxcar said, "Oz." That was I. That was me. The only other city I'd ever seen was Indianapolis, Indiana. 8 Dresdeners crossed the steel spaghetti of the railroad yard. They were wearing new uniforms. They had been sworn into the army the day before. They were boys and men past middle-aged, and 2 veterans who had been shot to pieces in Russia. Their assignment was to guard 100 American prisoners of war who would work as contract labor. A grandfather and his grandson were in the squad. The grandfather was an architect. The 8 were grim as they approached the boxcars containing their wards. They knew what sick and foolish soldiers they themselves appeared to be. One of them actually had an artificial leg and carried not only a loaded rifle but a cane. Still, they were expected to earn obedience and respect from tall, cocky, murderous American infantrymen who had just come from all the killing at the front. And then they saw bearded Billy Pilgrim in his blue toga and silver shoes, with his hands in a muff. He looked at least 60 years old. Next to Billy was little Paul Lazaro with a broken arm. He was fizzing with rabies. Next to Lazaro was poor old high school teacher Edgar Derby, mournfully pregnant with patriotism and middle age and imaginary wisdom, and so on. The 8 ridiculous Dresdeners ascertained that these 100 ridiculous creatures really were American fighting men fresh from the front. They smiled, and then they laughed. Their terror evaporated. There was nothing to be afraid of. Here were more crippled human beings, more fools like themselves. Here was light opera.